Yo, what is up YouTube? It's Alex again from A. Lewis Films, and today we're gonna be talking about frame rates, when you should change them, and why for that specific look. Let's roll it. Guys, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for joining in and watching this video. Before we get started talking about frame rates, it would be awesome if you guys would consider subscribing to the channel. Here on this channel, I make videos about gear and videos about just filmmaking process, and it would be awesome if you could join along. Now let's talk about frame rates. Now before we continue, I'd like to note that this video and all the other videos on my channel are rendered out in a 24 frames per second timeline from Adobe Premiere. So if you'd like to get similar results from the videos that you see on my channel, then you're gonna wanna be exporting out at 24 frames per second, regardless of the frames that you're shooting at. So let's jump right into talking about frame rates. So when and why do I shoot in 24 frames per second? I like to shoot in 24 frames per second is because I believe it has the best cinematic look. And it's also the closest version of film that you can get that replicates the human eye.
Literally. Okay, it's almost there. Okay.
So the way that we perceive things, 24 frames per second is the closest that you can replicate that. For instance, at a wedding, during a ceremony or a speech, is the best time to be shooting 24 frames per second because you're gonna be replicating that natural human cinematic look that you would normally see in real time, in real life. So I'm often shooting bridal and groom prep at 24 frames per second too, because I'm really going for that cinematic natural look. I don't tend to slow shots down like the groom putting his jacket on or like brushes going across the bride's face. That stuff, I just want it to look really natural to the eye. And I like to build the pace of the film up with those fast cuts and the high energy pacing in that moment of the day. There's a lot of action going on, a lot of people moving around, so that's not really the 60 frames per second time for me. I like to stick to 24 frames per second during that, unless it's a very specific shot that calls for it. So if you're watching this video right now and you shoot bride prep in 60 frames per second, I'd love to hear why you love that style and how it works for you down in the comments below. So just another tip to keep in mind, if you're new to filmmaking or if you're just figuring out how to shoot different frame rates, you're always gonna wanna double the shutter compared to your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, you're gonna wanna be shooting at 1/25 shutter speed. This gives you the proper motion blur, especially if you're gonna be doing those gimbal movements and everything, you're gonna wanna shoot at proper motion blur. Now, if you wanna shoot above 125, say if you're outside, that's perfectly fine, but don't shoot anywhere below 125 if you're shooting 60 frames per second. Now, this also goes for 120 frames. Remember, you gotta double those frames per second to match your shutter speed. So 120 will equal out to 240 shutter speed around that area. So as long as you're over that, you're good to go. So I shoot 24 frames per second majority of the day. I do have a dedicated gimbal camera that I'll keep at either 60 or 120 frames per second, and this is completely out of convenience. But that 24 frames per second look is what's really gonna get you that cinematic, natural replica to the human eye look. So let's move on to how and why you would wanna shoot 30 frames per second. Now 30 frames per second is probably the frame rate that I'm gonna use the least throughout the whole entire day. My number one reason for shooting 30 frames per second is if my camera will shoot, like the Sony that I'm using shoots, 24 frames per second in 4K and 30 frames per second in 4K. And if I wanna just have a little bit more flexibility with like slowing down to 20% back in post, I'll shoot like establishing shots or anything with a little less motion happening within the frame. If the couple's in the frame and there's, they're moving around, if it's portrait time, I wouldn't recommend shooting 30. I would go over to 60 if you're looking for that really buttery slow motion look. But 30 frames per second works really well on establishing shots, or like myself, I use that for real estate videos because I want to keep my camera in that 4K mode. Although I do know a lot of awesome filmmakers that shoot their entire wedding day at 30 frames per second, like Garrett over at Gears, Glasses, and Gadgets. I'll link his channel down in the description below. Go check out his awesome Sony reviews on all their new gear and tech. So let's talk about the fun stuff, shooting 60 frames per second and higher at the wedding day. Now, 60 frames per second is gonna let you get those buttery gimbal movements that everyone wants to see. You know, those really cool reception details, or that first dance epic shot with the light in the background just swinging around. That's the frame rate that you're gonna wanna use, and that's the frame rate that I personally use majority of the day on my gimbal camera. It's very important to remember convenience as a huge factor during your wedding day. If you wanna get those buttery slow motion shots, for me personally, it's worked best to have a camera dedicated to 60 frames per second on a gimbal. So I know if the photographer's running out with the couple, I can pick up the camera and follow along without having to take cameras off of tripods or monopods and switch them back on. And I even have my camera programmed for a quick setup for either 60 or 120 frames per second. So if you're new to wedding filmmaking, or if you want to start shooting in higher frame rates, make sure that convenience is on your side. Keep in mind, when you're shooting 60 frames per second in a documentary filmmaking atmosphere, you're gonna have to take lighting into consideration. When you ramp up that shutter speed, your image is gonna get a little bit darker because your lens is essentially letting in less light. So what you're gonna wanna do is make sure you're bringing lights with you on those receptions, first dances, and speeches and stuff like that. So to wrap it up, shooting at 60 frames per second is by far, personally, my favorite way to shoot slow motion footage at the wedding day. It's convenient. I have my camera set to 60 frames per second. It's just slow enough for me. The 120 is just a little overboard when it comes to weddings. I do see people like Matt Johnson using 120 and make it look super epic and awesome. But for me personally, 60 is pretty much my happy place when it comes to slow motion. But Alex, I want to know how to get those Peter McKinnon style B-roll sequences. Well, let's talk about 120 frames per second.
Getting stuck, I see feet in the mud. You have been caught in the flood. While the water isn't parted, we run, reap what you sow, the harvest is us. You have been enjoying life, sipping the syrup and a line in the white. Taking whatever you touch, the sword of the wicked is covered in blood. Welcome to the city of the 9 cents. Pleasure is the peace we can find in. Dive in, ride a shotgun alongside the divided. Taking a piece of the pie, takes what was provided. We won't be silenced, the path is widened. We found our God in. Blood, sweat, spit, and these bricks for Babylon. Made from the dust, these souls we trampled on. You have been caught in the flood. I have been caught in the blood. What you need right now? You have been caught in the flood. Wrapped in the sea right now. You have been caught in the flood. I have been caught in the blood. What you need right now? You have been caught in the flood.
So if I'm gonna be shooting a specific shot at 120 frames per second, it's so important to consider bringing a small LED with you. Why does it have to be small? Why can't it be huge? So I can make sure that my subject is, lit well. Lit well. My last name is lit well. It's my happy pace. So I don't personally shoot a whole lot of 120 frames per second shots. I usually shoot 60 frames per second. 120 is a little over dramatic for me at a wedding day. 60 seems to be that perfect medium. So to wrap this video up on frame rates, I just want to remind you guys that the best way to learn about frame rates is just to shoot and shoot again and edit and make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. It's the way we all did it. It's how we all figured out what look and style we were going for. So I just can't recommend to you enough to just go out there and to keep shooting at different frame rates, bring them back to your editor, slow them down at different paces, and see what really fits your style. Thank you so much for watching this video today about how and why I use frame rates. I'm so excited to hear how you guys use frame rates in your wedding films. If you're new to this channel, if you would please consider subscribing. If you're into filmmaking or wedding cinematography, that's what I do, and that's what I'm going to continue making videos for on this channel. I'm so excited to be a part of this community. And I'll see you guys in the next video.